The title of my sermon this morning, you'll notice it in the songs and what we've talked about, is Resting in the Cross of Jesus. Resting in the Cross of Jesus. And this morning I'm going to start by reading straight from the Bible. We'll start with reading from Hebrews, a very difficult book. And I'm not going to explain the entire book or the entire section. It is actually very complicated. I'm going to paraphrase different parts in a few minutes. But I'm going to start with reading chapter 4, verse 1. And you'll see the reference there that he's already made to Psalm 95 about arrest. And I'll explain a bit of that in a minute. But let's start with Hebrews chapter 4, 1 through 3. Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. He's still talking about Israel. He's talking about Numbers. He's talking about Israel right there. And he's quoting it here, Psalm 95. For we who have believed entered that rest, just as he swore, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. Now, if that doesn't have you confused yet, no, I'm teasing. We'll sort this out in just a few moments. But entering God's rest, just saying that phrase, doesn't that sound sweet to your soul? Amen. On a week like the year that we've had, entering into God's rest. You know, whatever God's rest implies, it sounds pretty good to me. And I know many people have asked, and they've asked me, where is God in a time like this? When it feels the earth is shaking underneath our feet, when people are hurting, when there's tragedy, when there's struggles, when there's difficulties, when there's lying, when there's manipulation of power, when there's all these things going on, where is God? Does God even notice us? Does he even care? And then the people come to the last point, is there even a God at all? Where are the resources we need in such a difficult and hard time to make it through? There were those I know who felt this very week, if you're one of those who were without power, without water, who were concerned about their resources, their basic, normal resources that they depend on for life. Now, it makes you, when you have no resources, you get this one particular feeling none of us like very much. Vulnerability. I don't like feeling vulnerable. Nobody feels like being vulnerable. And so what happens is when people start feeling vulnerable, they go and hoard H-E-B and Walmart. And take everything they can find on the shelf because we're going to be cold for 2 more days. And they apparently need a 4-week supply of food. That's what vulnerability, when we're not comfortable, we don't trust that resources are there, we can act pretty gross as humans, pretty disgusting, pretty down, pretty selfish. And this morning, my aim is for you to know that the cross of Jesus Christ leads us to great comfort in knowing that God is in control, come what may. Be that there's bread out at Walmart and H-E-B, be that you can't find eggs except for under a chicken right now. God is still in control. The cross means God cares and makes himself available now. First, I want to explore a little bit about what it means to enter God's rest. Now, this is a complicated issue as you move from Genesis chapter 1 all the way through to the New Testament. And I'm not going to untangle it all for you this morning because I have a paper that I wrote for my doctoral D-Min stuff, and I barely touched the surface with a 20-page paper. So I'm not going to try to entangle it for you. I'm going to try to give you the basics, the paraphrasing, the implications. So here's the argument Hebrews 4 is basically making. I've untangled it a bit for you. First of all, God rested on the 7th day, and such, God rests from that creational work. God entered his own rest on the 7th day. We're familiar with that. Genesis chapter 1. Now, in the Exodus, God's creating a new people. And he has them rest on the seventh day. He gives them a Sabbath. But this is a time-based Sabbath. See, in Israel, there's not just one type of God's rest. There's time rest, and that's Sabbath time. And so after a week full of work, they join into God's rhythm, his creational rhythm, and they join into that. So on their seventh day, they rest too, as such as God did. But the one people really don't miss is there's also an area, geographical-based rest. And that's where they were going. That was the promised land. That was a place of rest which centered on the tabernacle at first, when they're on their way and when they're first there, and then it centered on the temple. And that is what we call God's place of his most intense presence. I don't know how else to say it, but that was where the veil between God and man was the thinnest, might be another way to say that. The Holy of Holies was that place where you're as close to God as humanly possible. So, Psalm 95, so that's, they get set up, they're in the temple, and in Psalm 95 I think it's best to understand the psalm is they're walking up to the temple to worship. And they're singing, hear our praise, hear our stuff. That's what I read. And then when they get there, someone is saying back to them the rest of Psalm 95 and saying, do not forget your faithfulness as you walk and come into God's presence. And basically, he says this at the end, there's still a rest. And Hebrews is pointing out that, wait a second, if they're there on the Sabbath, they're there at the temple, and they still need to enter God's rest, Hebrews argues there's still a rest that needs to be had by the people of God. So, I'll get into some more of the details because this ends up going through Isaiah and stuff, and I'll explain that later. But you get to Jesus, and Jesus, the ultimately faithful one, entered that rest through his complete faithfulness to God. He's the faithful Israel. He's the faithful one, the high priest, as we shall call him. I'll come back and again, I'll complete this whole thought in just a moment. But when I read this, when I read Hebrews 4, I cannot help, I think Brad said it just a minute ago, I can't help but realize that maybe I'm taking God's availability to us for granted sometimes. I mean, it's almost like we have a right to God's presence. I have a right to go to church. Sure, in America we can talk about that. But you don't have a right to God's presence by your own anything. It's all a gift of him that we can even come into his presence at all. Isn't that amazing when you think of that? That's why we're here. There's people out there then, and I hope when you're online and you're with us, joining in God's presence, that's wonderful. But a lot of times people think they don't want to go to because they don't want the burden of having to be in God's presence. And sure enough, if you're not following Christ, it can be quite a burden on your whole heart and soul. But for us, it's a gift. And I just want us to remember that when we're at worship, when we're going through these difficult times, when we've had a difficult week and we've had a difficult year, that I know we need to recover in so many ways. But if you have a person with God with all the resources that you need spiritually, emotionally, mentally here available for you. This wasn't always true. This is not how people always thought. The supposed gods of the ancient Near East, well, they had some similar ideas. We have some of their ancient texts. And they had this moment where it was said that their supposed high god brought about order out of disorder. But then they made mankind, to go and do all the work for them so that they could rest. And this actual term pulls up, entering into their rest. The only ones who were able to enter their rest were other minor gods and demigods and all the pantheon that they had. People were not allowed to enter into that rest. That was an unforeseen thing. Basically, you just worked for keeping the gods happy, and if you made them happy, then maybe they would pour a little rain down on you. There was no sense of entering into God's own deep sense of absolute sovereignty. When you think about it the old way, that makes religion such a burden. To think that all this is constantly trying to please a God and please a God and please a God so that you can have your lights turned back on. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing to come here and go, you know, God, I know that the only way my lights are going to come back on this week is I come to the altar and I throw a couple $100 in the offering plate. Our God doesn't work that way. But that's how a lot of times people see and think that's how God works. And some have said religion feels like a dog race. And you've probably seen a greyhound race. And the greyhound race, this rabbit-looking thing is motorized and it's flying around oh, wait a second, that's gambling. I'm not supposed to know that, right? No, I've seen it online. And so you go around in a circle around the track and it's coming around it's like being in a greyhound race, right? It doesn't matter how fast those dogs run. They're never going to catch the rabbit. Religion feels like that to people. Man, Wade, you talk about God bringing rest. You talk about the amazing experience that God can give you. You're talking about having God's power in your life. But you might feel a little bit more like you're in a dog race, doing everything you can to try to claim it. And the harder you run, the more it feels like God's not quite happy enough with what you've done. This motivational strategy burns people out. It makes them angry with God. It makes them wonder if there really is a God. As I was looking through this, Isaiah 51 and 52, it's a pretty interesting little section in so many ways, but Isaiah toys with Israel's misunderstanding of the other pagan gods and Israel's God. And he says that Israel's going, I'm not making a connection to God. I'm not able to do that. And he quotes Israel, and he says in the beginning of chapter 51 that Israel saying to God, wake up, God, wake up. We can't hear you. You're not doing what we need to happen. We've just been conquered by Babylon. We've just been taken over. We're in a terrible place. Where are you? And Isaiah chapter 52 starts up and he says, you need to wake up. You need to wake up. Even though I'm in my rest, I'm here. I've created everything. I've given you all that you've ever needed. It's time for you to wake up. And then he promises. He said, when he says entering God's rest, it doesn't mean he ain't doing nothing. He says that he is going to send one who is faithful. Right after he tells them to wake up, and they've tried to get him to wake up, how gracious is this God to immediately say, I'm going to send a suffering servant, and he's going to wake you all up. He's going to wake you up spiritually in a way that you've never seen, with new spiritual eyes. A Holy Spirit will come, and he will be there. And so we find, even through Isaiah and the suffering servant, that it is through the cross that Jesus brings us into his rest. Let's find out how he does that. In Hebrews chapter 4, 14 through 16, this is the end of a long section that goes from the beginning of Hebrews chapter 3, all the way through the end of Hebrews 4. But I'm going to read the summation of this. Therefore, this is a familiar verse. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. What a beautiful verse. Can't really take this out of Hebrews 3 and 4, though. So many people like to pull it out of. But the basic premise of the Hebrews 3 through 4 is that we have this ultimate high priest who leads us and allows us to enter God's presence. Make sure in your life that you are taking advantage of that through your worship and obedience. Make sure you're entering into that presence. How does this work, though? He kind of tells us a little bit how this works. I wouldn't say this is how it works, but he's giving us a particular image here that's very helpful. The greatest day of rest, you might say, in Israel was called the Day of Atonement. This links back to what Brad was talking about earlier. The high priest would make sacrifices for himself to purify himself. Now, Jesus didn't have to do that. We know that. But then he would make sacrifices for all of Israel, for everyone. And those sacrifices was a way to purify not only himself, but to try to purify the land. And then, after those purifications were made, he would enter into the Holy of Holies, and he would worship the Lord in the Holy of Holies, and he would bring petition to the Lord one-on-one for the whole of all people. Now, you have to almost get this imagery in your head before you fully grasp what it means that Jesus is doing this in heaven for us. He's in the ultimate Holy of Holies. So, first of all, you see that the cross is this sacrifice. He didn't have to make one for him, thus he was perfect. And this perfect sacrifice is made, and it's not made just for him. First of all, he doesn't need it, but it's making it for all his people, all those who would call him Lord, all people who would have faith in Jesus Christ. He makes atonement for. And it's an offering to all people. Every person is offered to be and become one of his people. And he makes that right there. And in Hebrews later, it's actually imagined, or he says it happened actually in the heavenly Holy of Holies. On a heavenly altar, Jesus made his sacrifice. In other words, he's making it ultimate. That he died for you. Now, what's so critical here is this. Jesus goes into the Holy of Holies first, right? He ascends into the heavens, the Holy of Holies. To be in God's presence is what the Holy of Holies is. But he said there at the end, we can draw near in confidence to the throne of grace because it's a perfect sacrifice for us. We can have that access both to Jesus and to the Father. That's an amazing thing he's offering. And it says he was like us, or he was tempted like us, and he sympathizes with us. What this means is what they're getting at here, not only did he go through much of what we did, and though he's perfect, he didn't sin, it's a comparison to all the way other people thought about gods. Other people thought gods were aloof. That they were, once you got to heaven, you didn't care about Jesus got his way. He went up to heaven, or some other god, right? People might imagine he took care of his business. The gods were aloof. They were separate. They were distant. Our Jesus is right here, walking beside us in the tough trenches of life. That's what this Hebrew author is trying to get across. He is accessible here and now to us, not just out there, waiting for us to someday arrive. This is an encouragement he's giving to these people who are going through their own trials and their own sufferings. We are connected. Now, here's why the cross still matters so much in our lives. So a series on the cross, I might not talk about it for a moment. The cross is still very central to this, because to enter God's rest is not to rid oneself of struggles. It is not to get oneself rid of trials. That is not what it means to enter God's rest, is to do nothing and to have an easy life. Remember how he fears some of us may come short of his rest, the Hebrew author may come short of his rest. The Christian life of obedience is still cross-shaped. It's still cruciform. It's still self-sacrificing. It's still a life of giving. This rest of God is found by denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following him. This is because living a cross-centered life means depending on God and loving others. A cross-shaped life is depending on God and loving others. And when you are entering God's rest, that is basically essentially meaning you are depending on God. For what? To be obedient, to be faithful, because you need his strength to be completely who he created you to be. Have you entered into God's rest? He says we can do it now. He doesn't say, are you going to enter into God's rest someday in the future when you go to heaven? He says, I'm failing right now. God's rest is available to you. Have you entered into God's rest? Have you walked out? Have you entered into God's joy, God's presence lately? Are you pulled about by every anxiety and argument, full of rebellion, full of isolation? If you have not entered into the rest God provides for you, then don't say you have. If you haven't known God's rest in your life, don't pretend, don't tell yourself you haven't. That you have, I'm sorry. Don't tell yourself that you have. Charles Spurgeon, one of the great preachers of the 19th century, tells of a pastor when he was at a conference, was asked to speak on the subject of joy of God. And he got up there, came to the pulpit, and he said, I'm sorry, I was asked to talk about God's joy, for the fact is, I don't know what it is right now in my life. I'm not walking in the light, I'm walking in the dark. I'm not experiencing God's joy. And then he quoted from Psalm chapter 51, where David himself was mourning. And he says, restore to me the joy of your salvation. He wept, and so did all who were set there and who had tried to hide it. All full of different pastors, full of different folks who had gone to church most of their life. They had not entered into God's rest lately. They had come to church, they had gone through things, but they had not depended solely and trusting in God. Your honesty before God will do more good for you than some tale about what happened 20 years ago in your life. About a story about what someone else had joy and what that looked like for them. Have you entered God's rest? Yeah, I think if we're all honest, we have all known anxiety and rebellious hearts, striving for me, the urge to take care of me and mine this year. We have known what it means to lash out at people, to imagine the worst of what someone said. And God has shown many of us during this time how independent from Him our hearts have grown. How the rest we entered and the rest that we were living in before all of this, well, that was our making. That was our dependence on different other things. We were very satisfied. I was very satisfied with many other resources. And when those started to crumble, were you still satisfied? Were you still comfortable in His arms? I long to enter into your rest, O Lord. Would you say that in your head, in your heart? You could say it out loud if you want. Lord, I want to enter into your rest. Entering into God's rest is to depend on God's resources for our life of faithfulness. If you haven't gotten that through my sermon yet, there it is on the board. I wonder what we would do if we had access to somebody with incredible power, somebody with immense authority in our world, especially this last week, in this last episode of Crazy. I wish I had access to someone powerful who could turn the power back on. I don't even need that. Who would at least make my house part of the rolling power cycle, right? We were off for 60 hours, and I kept hearing they're rolling, and I'm like, it ain't rolling over here. Who do I need to call? I don't know people that powerful, but if I did, I'd be on the phone. If I knew somebody powerful, you know, I could at least get a little electricity in my life. What would you do with your life if you had access to someone with truly immense wealth and power? Why would you ask to enter into God's rest if you don't have an answer for that? Don't ask. You need to have a clear understanding of what you would do in your life, a holy calling. What would you do with your life if you were to enter into God's rest? Is it so that you could do nothing but chill? and hang out. Yep, this is God's rest. I'm going to enjoy it every day of my life on this couch. That's not what it means to enter God's rest. Never has. Is it so that you can go about your own busyness? That you can go about your own dreams that you had been planning so that you can accomplish what you wanted to accomplish for your kingdom? What would you do with this power? The final verse of chapter 4 again is helpful for me. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace and help of time of need. There's got to be some context to this. Of course there is. He's talking to people who are on mission for God. You can't just pull this out of there and apply it to your own lives. I really wish we could. But what he's saying is God's resources and God's rest. Well, God's putting his money where his mouth is. It's essentially another way to say it. He's putting his resources in people who are being faithful. Now, knowing have these resources, so now that you know, let's say, okay, I know what I want to do if I had access to true power. Knowing you have the resources at your back, what can you do? This is where rest comes in. The anxiety goes away because you have resources, right? For the mission that he's called you to. And you can be more focused and you can be more aimed at your calling in the midst of life's great storms. When storms hit you, you still have a resource, don't you? Because you're on mission for God. I think the clearest picture of this is in Mark chapter 4. Love Mark chapter 4. I guess I should love the whole Bible, but really get Mark chapter 4. Jesus is sleeping in the boat during the middle of the storm on the sea. A chaos of the sea upon the chaos of the storm. I mean, it doesn't get more chaotic in the ancient world, especially mind, than that. And the disciples come up to him, and what do they say? Don't you care that we're perishing? We're all about to die, and you're sleeping. Now, this is it's kind of a weird text for a lot of folks. But then Jesus gets up, he calms the storm, and we get that. We love that Jesus calms the storm. But frankly, I don't just want to be a disciple in fear, calling out every time, not knowing what to do. But I do want to call out to Jesus. But here's the thing. Why was Jesus sleeping in the middle of a storm? How could he rest in the middle of a storm? It's the miracle before the miracle. It really is. The image of Jesus sleeping in the storm is his faithfulness in God, his faithfulness to God, his faith in God's divine control in the midst of his own mission to the cross. The sleeping does not indicate powerlessness. It certainly does not indicate apathy or not caring. But it tells us about Jesus' understanding his own absolute and infinite authority given to him by the Father. It is he knowing that he has all the power of God both in himself, but also what's given to him in the Father. All authority is being given to me on heaven and earth. And at this point, he's demonstrating that. Oh, that's a post-resurrection statement. He's saying that here. He's showing what kingdom looks like because he trusts in the Father for his mission. He's not tossed about by some storm simply because he has a clear idea that he is in the service of his Father. Now, if he didn't make it through the storm, Jesus, I believe, would have been satisfied. Make sense? Some storms of life we don't make it through. Sometimes persecution comes, sometimes chronic health issues come, sometimes that storm does not end. But the Father is still the Lord of the storm. Jesus was always experiencing God's rest, which is the irony. Of course, I love that it's the irony between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees keep claiming that Jesus didn't keep God's law about Sabbath, while he kept claiming they never really experienced God's rest. They never experienced God's presence. They never really practiced God's grace. Because that's what comes from entering God's rest. When you can experience God's grace, God's rest, you can practice that for other people. One of the ways you can tell that you are not in God's rest is you've lost your grace for other people. You don't have any time for them. You don't have any patience for them. You don't have anything to give them, but get out of my way. It's my way or the highway. That means you're off mission. You're out of grace. You've missed your mark somewhere. And you need to come back to the Lord and say, Lord, I want to enter into your rest. I'm giving myself back over to you to be your image to the world. The implication in this verse we just read, in Hebrews, following Jesus means you will live in the storms. You will go through trials and troubles, and you will need God's power and strength. But we have such a great God that because Jesus Christ died on the cross, and he went into heaven, and he speaks for us, and he has the resources. He has God's ear, the Father's ear, so to speak, that he mediates for us with the Father. That we can go and we can know a life that's abundant. We can know a life that is full. Not easy, not perfect, but full. Will you stand strong in faith, trusting in the faithfulness of God? Will you stand strong, trusting in the faithfulness of God? I have a book called 100 Decisive Battles of History. Don't know why I love history, but I love reading these battles. Moments when winning or losing would make the world seem so much different. It's decisiveness, right? These epic battles. I could give you some examples, Thermopylae and different ones, the great battles of history. The victorious side's numbers, which you find when you read this book so many times, the victorious side's numbers were a lot less than those who lost. But the side with the fewer people, when they won, you started to realize they had some of the great generals of all time, usually very experienced generals. The outnumbered army knew that their leader was so skillful, so certain to win, that despite waves and waves of attackers, they stood strong, that they kept their feet. They rested their lives in the hands of their general, and they found great victory. Such should be our confidence in Jesus Christ. Whatever we look out upon in our lives, whatever you happen to see coming your way, as in droves of anxiety, of pain, of fear, of unfairness, will you sway from the cross of Christ, or will you stand firm? We shall not lose hope, whatever comes to us. For even though pain and death does come our way, our faith unites us with the victory of Jesus. We have victory. It's not just an old song. We have victory in Jesus. Can you stand firm in Christ, trusting Christ, knowing that? Because you have decisive battles that are coming your way in life. We all have some decisive battles. They determine the direction of your families, of your communities, of the church itself. Can you stand strong in the face of the mocking that your God is not real? Can you stand strong in the face of a world full of all kinds of other resources who promise you a good life right now? Can you stand strong when people tell you it's not worth the sacrifice? Will you call upon your power, the government's power, or will you take up your cross and follow him?